Welcome to Processing Distortion, the podcast series here at BoilingFrogsPost.com. I'm Peter B. Collins, and today we bring you another Newsbud special presentation. Our founder and publisher, Sibel Edmonds, joins me from Bend, Oregon. Sibel, always good to have you with us.
Great to be with you and Christian today, Peter.
And our special guest is Christian Sorensen, and he is a longtime contributor to Boiling Frogs Post, and I have long appreciated his work, often cited in my daily podcast coverage. And Christian, we thank you for joining us here today.
Thank you both for having me. It is a true privilege, pleasure, and I look forward to getting into the nitty-gritty. So thank you.
You do an amazing job every month where you take a look at the Pentagon spending reports and you produce a detailed account for Boiling Frogs Post, which we call a distillation of DoD funding priorities.
Correct.
And I am looking at your most recent report for February 2016, and that's what I want to refer to today. I've got many questions, and then we're going to zoom out and try to put the detailed work that you do in a larger context. But first, Christian, tell our listeners about your background. You spent 4 years in the U.S. Air Force. You have been trained as an Arabic translator, and it strikes me that the work you do is informed by your military service and what I expect you witnessed on the front lines of the military-industrial espionage complex.
That's, yes, absolutely. My experience informs what I try to do. So I was very much brainwashed, for lack of a better word. I was gung-ho about being in the military, and only about halfway through, when I started reading on my own and educating myself, did I truly begin to understand the problems involved and just how enormous the corporate structure behind the military is. You know, I'd come across these, whether it's training devices or software or products or, aircraft or various platforms along the way, and they're all created by a war corporation. And that sort of didn't really, it sort of, was basically a siren, and I was like, what's going on here? So, yes, so I was an Arabic linguist for 4 years in the U.S. Air Force, and I would see these things along the way, just enormous profligacy, war spending. I'd go into the squadron one day, and there'd be these a wall full of plasma televisions, and this was a little thing, but it's sort of just this is taxpayer dollars, and so as I was going along, I sort of realized that the profits behind the war industry are what drives interminable war. It's as we were talking a bit before, and I really want to reiterate this: the U.S. is constantly at war because it is profitable. That's the reason. The titans of U.S. military industry, those who chair the boardrooms, and those at the nexus of Wall Street and Pentagon coffers, they're the ones who profit, and they're the ones who are directing all of this. They'll always find an enemy, and corporate media will always relay how quote-unquote evil that enemy is. If it's not communism, it's terrorism, which is for those who direct the industry, terrorism is so much more flexible, and anybody you dislike, you can call a terrorist. Now, there are certainly bad people out there, and I'm not saying that there aren't terrorists, but what I am saying is that profit comes before all of this, in that the U.S. will always be at war simply because it is profitable. And my experience in the military only reinforced that.
And Christian, when I look at the detailed spending list here, the data that you collect and analyze each month, one angle that I take is this is an inventory clearance program. The Pentagon has built up all of these assets for war. But if they just sit there and you don't use them, then there isn't, a continuing revenue stream to the Northrop Grummons, to the DynCorp and General Dynamics, all of these huge corporations that are profiteering on an ongoing basis and on a massive scale. And,
Yes.
so much of this is just written off as, we're keeping America safe. We've got Ted Cruz out there running for president claiming that Obama has decimated the military and that it's going to take a Republican to rebuild it. And when we go through this list and some of the quotations I'm going to cite here, I think listeners are going to understand just what a crock that is. So,
absolutely. No, just really quickly, yes, you're absolutely right. Red and blue, Republican and Democrat, are fully on board. This is not a partisan issue at all. They both profit from it. The military-industrial complex is spread across congressional districts, across red districts, across blue districts. It is entrenched, and they fund both parties. We think we're a democracy. There are two main parties that get all the airtime, all the corporate media, touts them. Obviously, we have more parties. We have Jill Stein and the Green Party. Fantastic, absolutely wonderful people. But they don't get the corporate airtime. And the red and the blue are 100% in bed with the contract with the war profiteers, with the war corporations who fund their very campaigns. And then they get into office and they are, beholden to these greedy individuals and these greedy boards. And what you said is absolutely true. The bureaucracy is self-sustaining. So it was built up during World War II, and instead of disbanding after World War II, it was basically parlayed into the Cold War infrastructure, and then it kept going and kept building after that. And then after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the disbanding of the former Soviet Union, they found a new excuse. They'll find terrorism, and there will always be this huge infrastructure that then is wielded, that basically has not a mind of its own, but it serves corporate profit. And so wherever the next bad guy of the day is, it will go and it will get after it, and it's frightening, actually.
We're talking with Christian Sorensen about the distillation of Department of Defense funding from February of 2016. So help me out here, and let's round off the numbers here to help our listeners absorb this. But the total spending, the amount of money that went out of the Pentagon in the month of February for about 209 individual contracts is how much, Christian? $27 billion?
Correct, yes. And these are very, very conservative estimates. So what I try to do is, every day at 5 o'clock, the Department of Defense spits out a list of contracts. And that contract list is in and of itself very, very conservative. The contracts, I believe, are only, the DoD is only required to notify the public on these lists of contracts more than, I think, 6 or 7 million. So anything less than that doesn't even come across the radar. And many of these contracts are to multiple war profiteers, but they're also, how do I say this? They're continuations, they're modifications of earlier contracts. So it's spread across time and space, and it's absolutely baffling. So the $27.4 billion is a very low estimate, because if there's any question, then I don't include it. And some of these contracts are very, very vague. Some of them don't even give amounts. They'll say, services. They'll say like support services to logistics, and that's it. And so it's very, very vague. So not only do you have no idea what the contract is about, but the funding's not even there, and it's baffling, to say the least. And the Department of Defense itself uses very, very clever legalese in order to skirt competitive bidding. So they have these laws on the books, these regulations. So FAR 6302, FAR 8405. 10 United States Code 2304.
I've seen
These
that.
are all different ways to not basically force war corporations to bid competitively, which would ultimately save tax dollars in the end. They basically use these laws on the books. They also use these various forms of DoD-affiliated businesses. So they have small businesses, small disadvantaged businesses, veteran-owned small businesses, women-owned small businesses, service-disabled veteran-owned small businesses, and it's absurd. They frame it like they are doing U.S. mom and pop businesses a favor by saying, oh, well, we're giving this to a woman-owned small business. Their term, not mine. Service-disabled veteran-owned small business. Oh, well, yeah, you're very nice, but that's not at all what's happening. You're giving it to a war profiteer who is cleverly presenting itself as a small business in a historically underutilized business zone, or a disadvantaged veteran-owned small business, and it's not a benevolent act. It is still part and parcel of the way that they skirt competitive bidding, thereby bilking the taxpayer of more and more
Well, and those categories you just described, women-owned and disabled-owned and veteran-owned, those are all carve-outs that were created to pass the pork along. And these carve-outs, for example, the late Jack Murtha was a powerful member of Congress, a Democrat from Pennsylvania. And he was on the Armed Services Committee and chaired it for a while. And he was just ruthless in requiring contractors to spend money in his district in central Pennsylvania. And I'm sure a lot of it went to his political donors and his cronies, and some of that was exposed when it kind of hit scandal mode back, I think, in 2005 or 2006. So, Christian, let me start here right at the top of your report, where you tick off foreign military sales. And one of the dubious distinctions the United States has is that it is the number one arms merchant in the world. Yes. And you detail here a $49 million expenditure, and it doesn't tell us what kinds of, it says non-standard weapons, parts, and accessories. Yeah. And these are going to Chad, Afghanistan, Iraq, Romania, Somalia, Niger, Burkina Faso, Djibouti, Pakistan, Peru, Congo, Jordan, Colombia. So $49 million, and when if you consider that an average figure, that adds up to a lot of money going to these relatively small nations every year.
Yes, no, it's really tragic. I mean, we could, there's only X pieces of the pie to go around, and when we spend all this money on war and on propping up despots around the globe and this and that, that's money that absolutely, if we had our priorities straight, absolutely could be spent on food, clothing, shelter, and it's absolutely tragic. So, foreign military sales. Unending war in Southwest Asia has been an absolute jackpot for U.S. war corporations in 2016 alone. Now, 2015 was off the books. It was absolutely mind-boggling. But I'm just going to talk about 2016 alone, just for brevity's sake. So I'll get back to that contract in a moment. But we have in January and February thus far given weapons, armaments to Iraq, to Israel, to Egypt, to Kuwait, to Turkey, and to Saudi Arabia. Now, we know Saudi Arabia is bombing the living daylights out of Yemen right now. It is one of the worst humanitarian disasters in the region, let alone around the world. And we have provided Saudi Arabia with practice bombs this year. Now, last year, we gave them Textron Industries, which actually is headquartered in Providence, Rhode Island. It gave Saudi Arabia cluster bombs, cluster munitions. We gave Turkey this year BLU-109 penetrator bombs and components. Now, that is manufactured by Elwood National Force, which is out of Irvine, Pennsylvania, and General Dynamics as well, out of Garland, Texas. And I give you the locations specifically so people listening within the United States can understand that it's not just northeastern Virginia, where they're close to the Pentagon, and these war corporations can have a real foothold and manufacturing industry. It is spread across Middle America, across small town USA. It is all over the place. It's very, very entrenched. So that's Turkey. Kuwait, we gave equipment and services for vehicle management systems, but no further information is given. So like I said, a lot of times you have these contracts, and they're not obligated to even tell you, to tell the general public, the U.S. taxpayer, where this money is going. They can actually say, oh, 49 million to equipment and services for vehicle, whatever, or even it gets even vaguer. They'll say services rendered regarding management systems. So there's no democratic transparency behind any of this. So that was to Kuwait, and I'm going to get back to Kuwait later on. Real quickly, Egypt, Israel, and Iraq. Egypt. So far in 2016, we gave technical services supporting M1A1 production. Now, the M1A1 is an Abrams tank, and Egypt right now is basically run by a dictatorship.
Well, yes,
and yes,
a military dictatorship.
Absolutely, and the U.S. is very cozy with them, and especially U.S. war profiteers since Sisi took power. So this Abrams tank is manufactured by General Dynamics Land Systems out of Sterling Heights, Michigan. I'll go to Israel in a sec, but I'll do Iraq real quickly. Humvees were given to Iraq. They're manufactured by AM General, which is out of South Bend, Indiana, in Mishawaka, Indiana. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly.
That is correct, yeah. I've been there.
All right, right on. And we also gave them C-130 sustainment. That's manufactured by Lockheed Martin out of Warner Robins Air Force Base. And we also gave them base operations and security for Balad Air Base, which was conducted by Sallyport Global Holdings out of Alexandria, Virginia. Last but not least, Israel. Goodyear Tires, out of all the possible culprits here, gave them tire support and maintenance, and Goodyear is based out of Akron, Ohio. So it's
and that's $43 million. And let me ask, because number one, this was a sole source bid. It says one bid solicited, one accepted, and it doesn't indicate, is this part of our overall $3 billion a year military support for Israel, or is this a gift in addition to the cash funding that we supply to the Israeli government?
Great question. So that's actually very hard to determine, because for most foreign military sales, the recipient country is required to basically give an itemized sheet that basically says, look, here's how we're spending it, here's what's going on, here are the companies that are involved, X, Y, Z. Now, Israel, of course, is always the exception to the rule when it comes to U.S. Congress, when it comes to U.S. Defense and intelligence. Israel is treated with kitty gloves, and this is a great example. We don't know what Israel gets on average, and this number is probably only going to go up courtesy of President Obama. Israel gets about $3.3 billion a year gratis from the U.S. taxpayer, and that much of that goes back into U.S. war corporations. So Israel buys a lot of stuff, and it's not just from Goodyear tires. They are, and I can get into this later on in the program, but they buy from across the spectrum. They go for the usual culprits: the Lockheed Martins, Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, Boeing, but they also go for a lot of the minor ones, especially construction. So Israel is big into, and this was a big trend last year in 2015, they use U.S. contractors, construction teams, and hire them to build in Israel. Now, I'm sure there's a nefarious purpose for this, but I haven't analyzed this quite as detailed as I would like. So, for example, Conti Federal Services, based out of Edison, New Jersey, gets a ton of contracts for Israel. So last year they built, quote, construction of a below-grade facility and 6 above-grade facilities. That was February 26th of 2013. In November 2014, on the 22nd, they built, quote, multiple buildings in Israel, including an underground structure on a military installation. On December 18th, 2014, they upgraded a military installation's fuel stations. On 1 May of 2015, concrete replacement building, improvement work in Tel Aviv, Israel, et cetera, et cetera. July 31st, 2015, they built Israel a photovoltaic power plant at an unnamed Israeli military air base. So Israel is not just involved in the U.S., the usual suspects. Mm-hmm. They are also deeply involved in U.S. construction work, which is, something in and of itself. So
now, my follow-up here is Goodyear sells tires and associated equipment. There are many other companies, both in the United States and around the world, that produce this. Why would the Pentagon not competitively bid the sale of tire products or the purchase of tire products that were then shipped to Israel?
It's a great question. I have no answer to that. I can only surmise that they're under absolutely no pressure to do so. I mean, the average U.S. and this is why I'm going to tie this into Newsbud, and this is why Newsbud is so important, because Newsbud will tell it like it is. They're under no obligation from corporate donors, from advertising, the restrictions inherent to advertising revenue. Newsbud is totally viewer and user supported and user funded, just like Boiling Frogs Post. And what happens here is the average citizen is inundated day after day, if they even turn on the television, with lies, distortion, and omission from the corporate media. And this is across the very narrow red-blue spectrum. So they'll turn on Fox News, they'll turn on MSNBC, they'll turn on CNN, and they don't hear about the Israeli military. They don't hear about human rights abuses, let alone the nuances of how deeply ingrained Israel's human rights abuses and military might is within the U.S. war industry. Now, I'm not saying that Israel is better or worse than the human rights abuses committed by war profiteers and their, essentially pawns in uniform who are deployed across the globe by politicians who don't care about them, and by politicians who are, by definition, corrupt because they take money from this massive war industry. So yeah, to answer your question, sorry, it was a little bit of a rant, but it's very important for me to clarify this.
Well, and let me just add to that, because I watch a lot of television news because I think it's important to know what the machine is pumping out.
Absolutely.
And for example, I force myself to watch the PBS NewsHour every night, and they don't have commercials. They have these what are called enhanced underwriting messages. And BAE Systems, which shows up repeatedly in your report here, a heavy defense contractor, they became a sponsor sometime in the past year. And they're not selling their products or promoting their brand to the public. I believe that they buy a position on the PBS NewsHour to remind the journalists who work at the PBS NewsHour not to cross them. And it creates an immediate conflict of interest where if they report critically on BAE Systems, they will have to say, and by the way, they're a sponsor of the NewsHour. And likewise, if you can stomach the Sunday morning political talk shows on the big networks, they're all sponsored by Boeing, Northrop Grumman, all of these defense contractors. And so when the debate, such as it is, turns to issues of war, national security, and American imperialism, it's a very sanitized discussion. Or it's just a warmongering discussion of, who can carpet bomb, at least rhetorically, more effectively than another. And so this is a very significant way in which the media is bought off and compromised by these war profiteers.
That's a great point. And we, the so-called right will demonize, the so-called left and say, oh, NPR, PBS, these are, they're hippies, they're progressive, they don't know what they're talking about. But no, the left is very much, the so-called left is very much compromised. NPR, PBS, they are still beholden to the dollar. And if, follow the money. And you mentioned BAE Systems, sponsoring PBS NewsHour. You absolutely better believe that the producers, the editors, the newsroom feel that pressure. They know, and it comes from top down. They know, absolutely, do not broach these subjects. And if you do, you need to give, under the guise of, fair and equal time, a spokesperson from, one of the war profiteers,
right.
Fair airtime. So just to talk about BAE for a second, they are spread across Phoenix, Arizona, Fort Wayne, Indiana, Nashua, New Hampshire, Linthicum, Maryland, Green Lawn, New York, Honolulu, Hawaii, Burlington, Massachusetts. They're all over the place, and they support. Yes, BAE Systems is headquartered in the UK, but their North American operations are part and parcel of the U.S. war industry. And I'm happy to give you a breakdown of where they're not just where they're located, but what they're into. And I'll just really quickly, for example, they last year engaged in foreign military sales to Saudi Arabia, which, as we know, is not exactly a stalwart of human rights. They provide a digital electronic warfare system countermeasures to Saudi Arabia, which will help with the bombing raids. And not that Yemen has a very sophisticated air defense system, but this is tragic. This is absolutely tragic. They gave air traffic control, foreign military sales to Japan and South Korea. They are deeply, deeply involved in some of the main foci of the war industry. San Diego, California is one part. They're deeply ingrained in the shipbuilding industry. And it goes on and on and on. They are part of the vertical launch. They are the main provider of the Mk-41 vertical launch system, which is made by BAE's Land and Armaments division, and that's out of Minneapolis, Minnesota, as well as Louisville, Kentucky. It keeps going on and on. They have a system, an office in Haifa, Israel, where the Mk-39 Mod 3 machine gun system is produced, which actually is also incidentally sold to the Philippines, which is the government of which is a partner of the U.S. in the so-called war on terror. Even though it's completely distinct from the prominent quote-unquote enemies of the United States. The Philippines have their own local grievances based on local history and local oppression, let alone the U.S. empire involvement back in the day in the Philippines, and it's still very much there. So that's just a quick taste of BAE. Then just real quick, Santa Clara, California, York, Pennsylvania, Sterling Heights, Michigan, McLean, Virginia, Norfolk Ship Repair. They're big into the East Coast naval industry, Kingsport, Tennessee, where they have an ordnance facility. So I'll stop right there. And
well, and Christian, let me just say that to prepare for this, I printed out the first 10 pages of your lengthy report. I underlined more than 100 items here, and we don't have time to talk about all of them. But let me just drop one here and ask you for comment. Lockheed Martin got $32 million, and it's not the only thing. I mean, they got $141 million to provide Greece with some modernization. But this one item, $32 million for a one-year extension of Iraq pilot training. Now, I don't get it. Iraq doesn't have an Air Force, do they? I mean, they got, a dozen MiGs left over from the 1970s. We have not given them any significant, fighter aircraft. We may have given them some reconnaissance type and maybe some, C-130 cargo planes. But we're not providing them with any kind of an Air Force, to my knowledge. So unless they're training helicopter pilots, what the hell is this about?
So that's a great question, and this is why the war industry is so harmful across the board. So the U.S. government went into Iraq in 2003, and regardless of the outcome of that, the U.S. war industry profits, and we can see right now that contract alone it shows how foreign military sales profit the war industry, because had that invasion gone without a hitch, no problems, the U.S. would then be able to exert influence on the puppet government, and would be firing off foreign military sales contracts left and right. And when the chaos ensued, that still benefits the war contractors, because then they can say, hey, look, you need our expertise, you need this and that. And so it's very, very, very. I can't stress how harmful it is, not just to the U.S. so-called democracy, but to struggling communities around the world. So you mentioned that contract, and that's very, very important. We have provided them with aircraft. I believe F-15 and F-16 fighters,
Okay.
and I believe that's what that contract is.
Did we sell them to them? Do we give them to them? I'm just not aware of any Iraqi Air Force assets.
No, it's both. So the Iraqi government right now is struggling financially across the board. Yet they find money to basically purchase not only aircraft, but land vehicles and expertise and base support services from U.S. War profiteers. So yes, we do sell to them, and there are also the occasional contract that we, based on our, how do I say this? And I shouldn't use our. I should use the U.S. government. The U.S. government will provide them free of charge with certain services. But this one that you referred to was indeed a foreign military sale. So we provide them with pilot training. We provide them with aircraft. We provide them with sustainment. And another thing I really want to emphasize is that the U.S. war industry and war profiteers will get other countries to purchase something. Say, for example, aircraft B, and they'll say, all right, you bought this aircraft, and then the company, the country that purchased that is obligated to return within 6 months and a year, and buy the maintenance and buy the sustainment. And that's where a lot of this money is really made in the long term. Once they hook you in, these platforms aren't compatible with. You can't just go to anybody else. If you buy from the U.S., you have to then buy the follow up from the U.S. And it's very that's how they get a lot. So earlier this year, we sold them Iraq sustainment for C-130 aircraft, and that's basically a prop plane, the Hercules, and it's basically a cargo transport.
Right.
And we're all over U.S. CENTCOM, which is basically the Central Command. The term basically used for the area of operations, Southwest Asia, plus I believe Egypt is also included in that. So Iraq gets Humvees, Saudi Arabia gets practice bombs. We went over Egypt's stuff. In Egypt, actually, Egypt and Raytheon together have successfully, and a couple other countries, but it was companies, but it's mostly Raytheon has basically helped Egypt seal the western border of the Gaza Strip and isolate it from the eastern part of the Sinai Peninsula, which Egypt is in charge of. And it's and Raytheon has corporate not headquarters, but offices in Israel, and the Israeli government and Sisi are very much open to the mutual goal of strangling the Gaza Strip. And so we saw a lot of Raytheon contracts last year for they're vague, but they're basically what I would term tunnel detection services, and basically trying to make sure that the last lifelines to Gaza, basically these tunnels that used to run with some success under the border between Egypt and Gaza, are choked off finally. And Raytheon is 100% complicit in that. Raytheon also, out of Fort Wayne, Indiana, materials and services for Jordan's armed forces. This includes command and control. So it's everywhere. It is across the board.
Well, Christian,
yes.
This is really stunning. I mean, your detailed knowledge of these issues is almost encyclopedic. And I want to turn to Sibel Edmonds here, because Sibel, I mean, Christian has so impressed me here just in the last 25 minutes or so. And this is just an example of what is perfect for the future of Newsbud, because what Christian demonstrates is that he's a critical thinker. He goes for the information that is publicly available, but the corporate media is too lazy to deal with and too compromised to report on. And these are the elements that have driven us to put Newsbud out for the Kickstarter fundraising campaign.
Well, likewise, Peter, I have to say I am sitting here and I feel I have been mesmerized by Christian because we've been working with Christian for almost 2 years with Boiling Frogs Post, and we never had a chance to talk before. And I found his reports to be stunning, amazing. It's not only what he puts together, but how he puts it together and the discipline to organize it and highlighting the important, significant elements in each one of his reports and how he's been so consistent month after month after month, sticking with it and doing it. But today, sitting here and listening to him, I just keep thinking, I mean, we are so lucky. We have such jewels with Boiling Frogs Post. And I'm so glad you mentioned the phrase that I really like to use, that rarity, that critical thinking ability, and someone who can go so deep into the macro issues, versus so many of these so-called journalists, even alternative ones, Peter, they constantly deal with the shallow elements. And even when they present, let's say, a topic such as military-industrial complex, it is like some kind of what I consider details that are not significant and conclusions that are not present. And what Christian has been doing here for 25 minutes, he's not only saying, here are the details of just this one aspect with military-industrial complex, but also how that ties in with so many macro issues. Okay, and whether it's the perpetual war state in the United States, the war profiteers, and the international aspects of it, and I have no idea why we haven't done this before. And that's another thing that I'm kind of caught off guard here. But also I know that I have to be meeting him very soon. So I know he's overseas, and I'm going to find out. And I really would like to meet him face to face. A couple of years ago, I did this show together with James Corbett, and the show was titled "Who's Sitting at the top of this pyramid?" We hear people talking about the deep state, some certain fragments of population who are into semi-critical thinking mode at least. And then, of course, we have all these hypotheses out there about, the Freemasonries and this and that. And during our show for 30, 45 minutes, I just dealt with military-industrial complex as one of the top elements, the top of this pyramid that we are talking about. Take this, the elections coverage. People, they get so bogged down and lost with mid-level powers, okay? Whether it's the elected president, be it Obama, or before him Bush, or let's say 9 months down the road, whether it's going to be Hillary Clinton or Rubio. And they start boiling everything down to these puppet-level, mid-level powers. They don't go above and beyond. And when you go and climb, and if you really want to know who are the real powers, okay? Who are the ones who are moving and playing the strings and the puppets attached to it, both nationally here and internationally? This is where you end up with. You are looking at the military-industrial complex. You are looking at the mega financial corporations. We are looking at the big pharma, okay? And just military-industrial complex alone, I believe, is the biggest part of what we coin as the deep state, as the real powers behind the scenes. And as both of you mentioned, the bloodline, lifeline of the military power for the military-industrial complex is the war, is the conflicts, both the broad macro ones internationally, but even within these nations. You get the Washington Post and New York Times run articles about Turkey basically massacring 150 Kurdish people and shelling this particular village, right? But what goes unsaid is for that, they are using the U.S. provided airplanes and the U.S. manufactured and provided bullets and the tanks and the bombs. And therefore, even though it is reflected as, oh, maybe this is human right abuses by Turkey, well, Turkey is doing it, implementing it based on what we give them. And these people who are sitting here at the top of these, these contractors, the military industrial complex players, they are profiting it. Every one of those bombs dropped is translating to certain dollar amount for these people. Now you remove that, the conflicts within the ethnic level, within the regional, small regional level, or the macro level, all of these are the bloodline of the military industrial complex. And that is the incentive to create enemies that don't exist to start with. And Christian mentioned Jordan. You just passed by Jordan. Well, we covered at Boiling Frogs Post 3.5, 4 years ago when nobody was even talking about Syria. This was right after we were finished with Libya, that they were training and they were preparing. This is the United States and NATO in Turkey, these elements, these factions from Syria, and in Jordan. We created ISIS. We needed ISIS. Al-Qaeda was getting to become the older enemy. We had to replace it with a new brand. And that new brand would pump again the massive cash amount into the military industrial complex. We need these Al-Qaedas and ISIS to justify to the simple-minded people who are not engaged in critical thinking, the reason for all these wars and their perpetual state.
And not only that, Sibel, I think that it does create that justification, and with the propagation of fear into the public, they then support even more spending and more war, and it becomes self-propelling. Where,
Absolutely.
as Christian has pointed out, a lot of these are old contracts that go back to the Cold War, to Gulf War I, to the interim period before the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan. Right. And this is legacy stuff that just keeps building and building and building.
Yes, and yet look at the coverage. I mean, it's driving me crazy. I am just completely avoiding it. Everything is based on the distraction created, the so-called show time for elections, what Trump said, and the rallies, and all these things. Okay, so yeah, on one side we have Kardashians and those distractions, but then what we call political news is this show that distracts from the real issues.
Excuse me, Sibel, we've got to stop everything. Donald Trump just tweeted.
That's exactly right. And yet here, so I'm glad again. I'm glad to hear how you and Christian tied it to Newsbud. This is the vision. This is what we want to do. This is what nobody else is doing it because, I don't know, it doesn't have maybe entertainment factor in it. It is not financed and backed and sponsored by advertisers. Of course, these NGOs, foundations, who are running them? I mean, he mentioned Christian, Northern Virginia. That's where I lived for 23 years. And I lived in these neighborhoods of McLean and Alexandria and Manassas. Where
Crossing, yeah.
Yes, and we were surrounded, all the neighbors, by these military industrial complex actors and players who were purchasing these houses for $3 million plus and having 3 cars parked there. And we are not talking about CEOs, Peter. I mean, we are talking about mid-level people who are now given this money. And people, they look at elections and say, oh yeah, well, people are contributing to these finances, campaign finances. Well, the real contributors are these people. The mid-level ones are the ones who are writing the $25,000 check for the blue one, the blue candidate, and another equal 25,000 for the red candidate for both sides. And their CEOs, what do you think they are contributing? So regardless of how they kind of give this illusion of differences, Trump versus Hillary, Hillary versus, I don't know, even Bernie Sanders. I mean, these people, the candidates have been already pre-selected and pre-elected. So who we see within the arena outside the independent third parties are, both sides of the same coin. What do you do when you want to flip the coin and you know that both sides are heads or both sides are tail? Why are you even bothering to flip that coin? Because you know the outcome. And yet everything is around the clock is on the elections. And yes, this is what we want to accomplish with Newsbud. And yes, this is why people are calling it impossible for this model. But I believe it's not. And not only that it's not impossible, it is needed, and it should be one of the most sought after model to a certain level counter what we are fighting against, because what we are fighting against, what we are trying to expose is enormous. It's huge.
And I want to take that cue to encourage people to go to newsbud.com. You can watch the video there that explains the mission and the purpose of Newsbud. There's a link there to our Kickstarter page, and when you get there, there's a budget listed, the players who have signed on to be with Newsbud if we're able to raise the money. And we've got a tight timeline here. As we speak, there are 23 days remaining, and we've raised just under $150,000. So I encourage you to share this interview, to spread the word to your friends and your networks online, and to do everything you can to help us make this a reality, because we really can change the media. And today we've demonstrated, I think, in a critical way, how Newsbud can do that with your support. Christian Sorensen, I want to thank you for your work, and thanks for sharing it with us today in such rich detail and such great enthusiasm. You really love this stuff.
You got it. Otherwise, you'll go crazy. And thank you both for your leadership in this regard. You are absolute champions, and thank you for your time today.
Christian Sorensen, Sibel Edmonds, thanks for joining me, Peter B. Collins. Thanks for listening to this Newsbud special edition of Processing Distortion. As always, I welcome your comments and feedback. You can email Peter at peterbcollins.com.